When people talk about risk, they usually speak as if it were a problem to be eliminated, a flaw in the system that smarter models, better data, or more disciplined behavior could eventually erase. Financial history books tell a far more uncomfortable story. Risk is not an error. Uncertainty is not a temporary phase. They are permanent features of any system involving humans, incentives, fear, and hope. And the central lesson running quietly through centuries of financial history is this: those who survive and prosper are not the ones who predict the future best, but the ones who build lives and systems resilient enough to endure futures they cannot imagine. If you read accounts of past financial crises, bubbles, and collapses, a pattern begins to form that feels almost tragic in its repetition. Every generation believes its circumstances are unique. New technologies, new instruments, new theories convince people that old rules no longer apply. And every time the same forces resurface under different names. Greed stretches confidence. Leverage magnifies small errors. Crowds reinforce shared illusions. Then reality intrudes, usually faster and more violently than anyone expects. Financial history books are not chronicles of ignorance. They are chronicles of forgotten lessons. One of the most striking insights from these books is how often intelligence fails to protect people from ruin. Some of the worst losses in history were suffered not by amateurs, but by highly educated, well-connected experts operating with sophisticated tools. The problem was not lack of knowledge, but excess confidence. When models begin to feel safer, then humility risk quietly concentrates in places no one is looking. History shows us again and again that danger rarely announces itself. It builds silently during periods of calm disguised as stability. Another recurring lesson is the asymmetric nature of risk. Gains accumulate slowly, but losses arrive suddenly. Fortunes built over decades can disappear in weeks or even days. Financial history forces us to confront this imbalance. It teaches that survival must come before optimization. The goal is not to maximize returns in good times, but to remain standing after bad times. Those who ignored this principle often achieved spectacular short-term success, only to vanish from the record entirely after a single misjudgment. Uncertainty, as these books reveal, is not just external. It lives inside human behavior. Fear and greed do not operate symmetrically. People take risks to avoid small losses, and then refuse to take risks to recover from large ones. They extrapolate recent trends into the future and dismiss long-term history as irrelevant. Financial markets change, but human psychology does not. This is why events separated by centuries, often read like variations of the same story, with different costumes and instruments, but identical emotional scripts. Financial historians also emphasize the danger of narratives. During booms, stories become simpler and more convincing. Complex systems get reduced to a single explanation that everyone repeats. These narratives are powerful because they remove doubt. They make participation feel inevitable and caution feel foolish. Yet history shows that the most dangerous moments are when uncertainty feels lowest. The absence of fear is often a better indicator of risk than its presence. Another lesson woven through these books is the importance of margin of safety. Those who survived repeated crises did not do so by being perfectly right, but by being slightly cautious all the time. They avoided fragility. They limited leverage. They accepted lower returns in exchange for durability. This behavior often looked conservative or even naive during booms, but it proved decisive during downturns. Financial history reminds us that the ability to endure error matters more than the ability to avoid it. Over long timelines, the books show that risk management is less about clever strategies and more about temperament. Patience during chaos, skepticism during euphoria, discipline when incentives push toward excess. These traits do not attract headlines, but they quietly separate those who compound wealth from those who experience dramatic cycles of rise and fall. The most successful figures in financial history often appear unremarkable in any single year. Their advantage only becomes visible across decades. As these histories unfold, another subtle insight emerges. Uncertainty cannot be diversified away entirely. There are moments when correlations converge, systems fail together, and safety disappears exactly when it is most needed. Books that examine great crises emphasize that preparedness is psychological as much as financial. Knowing in advance that uncertainty will eventually overwhelm plans allows individuals to respond with flexibility instead of panic. The worst decisions in history were not made because people lacked information, but because stress narrowed their perception at the exact wrong moment. And this brings us to the deepest lesson financial history offers about risk and uncertainty. Because once you accept that the future will always contain shocks beyond prediction, you stop asking how to forecast events precisely and begin asking a different, far more useful question. How do I structure my life, my capital, and my decisions so that I can survive mistakes, endure volatility, and still move forward even when the world behaves in ways that no model, no expert, and no historical analogy could fully prepare me for when the next crisis arrives, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of what history has always promised. This shift in perspective is subtle yet profound. Financial history books teach that uncertainty should not shock us, it should be expected. Once this expectation is internalized, behavior changes. Investors stop overreacting to noise. Businesses stop over-leveraging in pursuit of fragile growth. Individuals stop anchoring their sense of security to outcomes they cannot control and begin anchoring it to structures they can. At this stage, the concept of robustness becomes central. Robust systems are not optimized for perfection. They are designed to function under stress. Financial history shows that empires, institutions, and fortunes that endured were often inefficient by design. They held excess capital. They accepted redundancy. They moved slower than competitors during booms. This waste, so criticized in good times, became the very thing that allowed survival when conditions reversed. Risk management seen through history is less about elegance and more about slack. Another lesson that emerges clearly is the danger of linear thinking. Human minds prefer straight lines and smooth projections, but history unfolds in jumps and breaks. Small causes lead to outsized effects. Rare events dominate outcomes. Books that examine long arcs of financial history remind us that what matters most is not the average year, but the handful of extreme years that define trajectories. Preparing for those extremes, even at the cost of underperformance in normal times, is what separates endurance from extinction. Financial history also reframes diversification. It is not merely about owning many assets, but about owning assets that fail differently. During major crises, superficial diversification collapses as correlations spike. Those who survived best diversified across time horizons, income sources, geographies, and even personal skills. They understood that true resilience is layered. When one layer fails, another absorbs the shock. There is also a moral dimension woven quietly into these books. Excessive risk-taking often transfers downside to others while privatizing upside. History judges these actions harshly, not just because they cause damage, but because they erode trust in systems that depend on collective belief. Sustainable success, the book suggests, aligns incentives so that those who benefit also bear consequences. This alignment reduces systemic fragility and creates environments where uncertainty does not automatically turn into catastrophe. As individuals absorb these lessons, their relationship with uncertainty matures. Fear does not disappear, but it becomes informative rather than paralyzing. Volatility is no longer seen as an enemy, but as a signal. The goal shifts from avoiding downturns to navigating them with composure. Many financial historians note that the greatest mistakes occur not at the peak or the bottom, but in the moments of emotional decision-making between them, when pressure is high and clarity is low. Over decades, those who internalize historical lessons tend to build lives that look boring on the surface and extraordinary in outcome. They save more than seems necessary. They avoid catastrophic leverage. They plan for reversals, even when success feels secure. This behavior rarely attracts admiration in the moment, but it compounds into something far more valuable: optionality. The ability to wait. The ability to choose. The ability to act when others are forced to react. And so the ultimate lesson from financial history about managing risk and uncertainty is not a formula or a rule, but a posture toward the future. It is the acceptance that uncertainty is permanent, that shocks are inevitable, and that the only reliable advantage is preparation rooted in humility. When you stop trying to outsmart the future and start trying to survive it, you paradoxically gain more freedom, because survival gives you time, and time gives you more chances to be right than brilliance ever could. If this perspective on risk changed the way you think about money, career, or security, take a moment to reflect on one area of your life where you could build more margin of safety. Leave a comment with the insight that stayed with you most. And if you want to continue learning from the long memory of financial history, rather than the short noise of headlines, subscribe and stay with me as we keep decoding the lessons that only time can teach.